of our faith and politics discussion. How many of you were here last week?
Oh, last week?
Yeah, last week.
I watched it.
And you watched the video? Wow.
This week.
Oh, we got it in. I didn't. Way to go. We got it in. So, anyhow, those of you who are here and are back here again would probably agree with the sentiment that it was worth doing enough so that you came back. And I can't really speak for why everybody else stayed away in droves.
It's raining.
A recap of last week, just as quickly as I can. We watched a video with Michael Curry talking about the topic of faith in practice in a civil society. He said along the way that the way of love fulfills the moral law of God and the civil law. So vote love is basically what it comes down to. If it accords with the love of Jesus, that's the way we vote, he says. So, justice in the world around us, and I have that sheet there. That's kind of a quick list we came up with. In the world around us, we likely think of the criminal system and of just desserts. And I did point out last week that that's how you spell desserts in that case. People take exception with me, but I assure you that the root word is the same as deserve. And desserts, in that case, means that. It doesn't mean what you eat after supper.
And the other desserts are twice as good.
And they're twice as good. That's why they have two S's. Yes, there you go. In the Bible, justice is more than what's just for us. And then the question that we came up to was, how does our faith perspective shape our politics? And we're going to come right back at that question this morning. But again, I have those resources, including EMO, ROP, and EPPN, which I decided just to put up there for fun. EMO is Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. The Rural Organizing Project is the material that Betsy pulled together and shared. That's on one of those handouts there. She pulled together a comparison between what ROP, Rural Organizing Project, and Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, what they say, and put them side by side. It might be of interest to you. EPPN doesn't really have such a document, but I thought I'd just share with you there is such a thing out there. It is the Episcopal Public Policy Network. And if you ever kind of want to cast around about what goes on in the Episcopal Church and what we're thinking about such things, it might be nice for you to know that there is such a branch out there. As Peggy says, they'll send you emails if you go on the list. For better and for worse. All right, let's get into it. Just a moment. Reactions or responses from last week. Again, if you were either saw it on YouTube or you were here last week. Comments, reactions, responses, thoughts.
It was helpful.
Helpful?
I found it helpful.
Thank you.
Some new perspectives, thoughts, and connections for me.
Can you elaborate at all on that?
Well, actually, you recapped some of them, but sort of that. Okay, so for me, the whole idea of politics, justice, and then the Bible and spirituality and what I believe, a lot of that stuff is more connected now than it was. Because, and when you said, essentially I've grown up with the idea that you leave them, church and state, separate them. So this was a time where I thought very meaningfully, I saw how those could come together. And that was important for me.
I felt that you got to the basic, the bottom line, so to speak, where we get so lost is getting connected to what I would equate to the symptoms or the instead of the disease, if you want to put it that way, and we can get hooked up from an emotional or from some kind of past experience or something somebody said, often just the connection with the other people who are supporting it, those kinds of things. But and then we don't. It's a lot of work to work from that all the way down if you don't know where you're going. But starting with, is this the love of Jesus being lived out in the world? Well, then you work the other way and you say, well, what is love? Is this doing something that's loving to all God's creatures?
Thank you. Yeah.
It's
And the way I think of it, and you touched on it for me, and the way I think about it is so much of politics, and it goes on both sides, though personally I feel like it's more on one side than the other, but nevertheless it goes on both sides. Politics in general wants to appeal to our baser selves, and it wants to drive us to vote based on our fears, whereas justice asks us to vote for the love of God and the world and for our hopes and dreams for the future.
I think I said that last week, that instead of thinking what's best for me necessarily, it's what's best for everybody.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's such a nice, simple framework for talking to people about why you're doing what you're doing in voting, or any other public discussion about how we should run anything, including the country. And it incorporates very simply what Michael Curry talks about as being Jesus speak, but in an Episcopal way, showing Christianity is a very different thing than we think of often now. When Christianity gets involved with politics, it has kind of negative press, and it paints a certain picture of what Christians are. But this is a very different way to be Christian quietly, and nobody could argue with that statement. I mean, it's just what a lot of people think, whether they're Christian or not.
Good. All right. Shall we see if we can make some forward movement?
Sure.
Well, let's try a little bit. And whoops, wrong. Wait. Back to the subject at hand, shall we? We'll come back to her in a moment. What the heck? How come I keep losing that? All right, well, I'll just keep going back. So Tom Hanks. Gee, this comes really at what you were saying. Okay, let's compromise. You can keep Christ in Christmas, but you have to take him out of politics. Deal? Well, no, it's not a deal. You know, faith is more than one aspect of our life that we live here on Sunday morning that somehow should be kept out of the rest of our lives and the rest of our world on Monday morning and throughout the week. You know, and I'm a little reluctant to say it this way because of all the other connotations, but I guess I'll leave it that way. Faith should not be ghettoized or put on a reservation. It should be brought to bear in the whole of our life. The question is, and Jeannie, I think this really does get at your comment earlier. The question is, what kind of Jesus do we want to put up in our political sphere? Because there's at least two of them out there in the world, and there's and that's a real issue. And I think a lot of our current problems in our nation go back to what people of faith have done and failed to do. So I think, you know, there's a reckoning that we have to make room for as well. So faith and politics, in my mind, they all come together. This was a couple weeks ago. This was a story on NPR on Saturday 2 weeks ago. Workplace sexual harassment, a threat to victims, a quandary for bystanders. It was a lovely little article, in part because it talked to us. What do you do if you're in a workplace and you hear somebody say, I mean, what, you know, because it's awkward, right? Are there some strategies? And it gave some strategies. But the topic, born out of the current politics and the Trump video and all the rest, was broader than that particular incident. It was about what's going on in the workplace. And you women, if the statistics I ever find are true, mean anything, you women know what I'm talking about. It's a real thing out there. And so that was Saturday the 15th, this particular story, but it was one of a string of stories. This one wasn't focused on any political issue. It was focused on what the reality is like there in the world. And on Sunday, the next morning, we hear the story of the parable of the widow and the unjust judge. The woman who speaks up against a man demanding from him justice and proper treatment. How do those not talk to each other? That's my preacher's situation. I think they talk to each other. I skirted that just a little bit on that Sunday because it is too close to the current politics, and I have to be a little careful for lots of reasons. not to simply let this be one issue or about one person, and it's too easily, of course, just read that way. It's a bigger issue than that, of course. So what is the place where faith informs our politics? And this is my other video, and this one is relatively short, but I think it's helpful for us to hear some different perspectives from younger people. Nothing terribly helpful in many ways about that particular video, but I thought it was fascinating to listen to different people talk about it and come to absolutely diametrically opposed opinions as to whether or not it made a difference.
Well, there's two ways to think of faith being involved, and the one was, well, you vote for people who have the same faith that you do, and that's contrary to what we've been saying.
Yeah, I think so. It goes back to this thing, you want to take them out of politics. Well, it's which him or her do I want to take out of politics? Yeah.
The young man who said he was not going to vote based on his faith, he was going to vote for the person he thought could best lead. But I would say probably unconsciously his faith formed some of his belief about who will do the best job.
Sure.
I know what I think he was trying to say, I'm not going to blindly do it just because somebody else told me. But I think your core beliefs can't help but influence what choices you make.
Yeah, I think so. So let me try and move the conversation ahead a little bit. This is what we talked about last week, criminal justice versus social justice and or biblical justice. Again, this is one of the quotes from last week that I shared from this book, The Crucifixion, that some of us are reading. Somebody emailed me after last week's presentation and said, would you recommend I read that? And I wouldn't really. I mean, I'm having some problems with it. I'm not necessarily agreeing with it. It's good for a conversation with a particular group who's reading it, but I actually find this book a little troubling. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend you go out and buy The Crucifixion. That said, chapter 3 was awesome. We're all agreed about that. And it just has this description about biblical justice. Revelation, the point there. We talked about it last week. White American Protestant Christians generally think of God as loving and compassionate and merciful and all the rest, whereas a lot of other folks think of God as being primarily the God of justice. And there's something for us to wrestle with there. Because one God makes us really comfortable, and the other God challenges us. This was one of the passages in bold there that she highlighted in her chapter on justice. By coincidence, by happenstance, it's part of today's gospel, so I just thought I'd draw a little extra attention to it, in which basically God, through the prophet, says, I don't care if you're good church folk. If you're not doing justice, you're not doing what I want you to do. And I don't want to hear any more of your sacrifices and your churchy stuff. And then she concludes this particular section, or at least my recap of her chapter concludes this section with this business of whether justice is just for us. And if it's just for us, it's not justice as the Bible talks about it. If it's not for everybody, it's not justice. Last Sunday, Celine, in her wonderful sermon, this is a quote from it, there's still a place where we are all absolutely equal. The ground at the foot of the cross is level. And she went on and said a little bit more about that. But I made the observation last week about Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which talks about putting down the proud and the rich, sending them away empty, and raising up the poor. Well, we're all equal. Now, if you're rich, having the playing field leveled feels like a loss. What was the we were talking about this yesterday.
To the privileged, equality feels like
Oppression.
Like oppression.
Yeah, so to the privileged, equality feels like oppression. Which is really, I don't remember, where did you read that?
It was an LA Times op-ed about the Malheur verdict.
Okay, so LA Times. And when you play back some of the stories, marriage equality. how does that get played by people, straight people, who are married? They feel like somehow it's an attack on marriage. Because to the privileged, equality feels like oppression. Or we're talking about white America versus African American America, and restitution and other sorts of things. It feels like oppression to those who are being asked to level the playing field. It's a fascinating observation. Well, what else does the Bible say? Anybody want to? I'm trying to allow a little more time for conversation today.
The question's a little broad.
It's a little broad. I have some suggestions of answers coming up, but I want to open it up for a little feedback. Is there some other passage or scripture or something you go to when you're thinking about what does this say to me about how I live in the world? Yes, ma'am.
I'm constantly thinking about all the people Jesus was showing favor on or engaging with who were outcasts in that purification society. And I'm working on my judgmental nature. I'm a thinker comparer, and it's not necessarily always an awful thing, but I do tend there. And I'm trying to move that away. And so I think a lot about the us-them that comes just like in Jewish society at the time and what he was fighting against. We do it every day.
Apropos of that, I'll just fast forward to one of my slides.
Wow.
From Sojourners. This is, again, the Black Lives Matter movement. It gets a lot of pushback from people who are saying, are you saying my life doesn't matter? Of course we don't say your life doesn't matter. We just say black lives are endangered right now. So Jesus went out and he says, in a culture that looked down upon and attacked Samaritans, Samaritan lives matter. I don't quite get the Jewish lives matter inclusion, but I can see it in our contemporary context. Jesus actually took it for granted Jewish lives mattered. But Gentiles mattered.
Maybe during the Holocaust, Jewish lives.
But I'm going back to Jesus' time. That was a given in his culture, was that Jewish lives mattered. He was pushing back and saying, these other lives matter too, in a society that didn't necessarily accord them the same privileges.
Well, if you were a Jewish tanner, you didn't matter.
A Jewish tanner?
In those days.
Because?
That was an untouchable occupation,
Okay.
and you were dirt.
All sorts of untouchables,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Because you were Jewish.
There's neither Jew nor Gentile. What he's saying here is that you don't say these things aren't issues, but when you say this isn't just a spiritual thing, is what he's saying here. When you're doing it. Anyhow, we can move on. The tradition. And when I ask about the tradition here, I'm going to kind of ask us to limit ourselves to, what does the Bible tell me? Well, what does the prayer book tell me? Because in terms of Episcopal understanding, this is the contemporary. You want to go ahead and push number 1 while you're there? I won't do any more videos today.
I don't know if you heard it, it was ticking.
No, I didn't. Bill knows what that is. It has ticked before. I'm going to leave off when you think about tradition, you think about all our forebears. I want to leave that off partly because it's a very mixed bag.
Yeah.
Though there are a lot of lives that have been exemplary for us to think about in our own time. So you could think about the saints who have gone before. How did they live in their world? What does that say about how we live in our world? But I'm thinking about really kind of explicit teaching, because that's part of what the prayer book does for us. This is the contemporary expression of the Christian tradition as we embrace it within the Episcopal Church. So can you think about what this might say to us about how we live out our faith lives in the world? I do have more suggestions if you don't, but I want to give you a chance first.
What's the phrase in the baptismal covenant about seeking, serve, and I really am asking for help.
Yeah,
I'll give you those answers a bit later. When we do the baptismal covenant is one, so good for you. That's one. Yes, ma'am.
A number of our prayers of the people have justice for the earth and other people and prisoners and captives and lovely language about it.
Prayers of the people, Form 4 this morning. I heard it with special sharpness this morning. The second of the petitions. This is my prayer. Guide the people of this land and of all the nations in the ways of justice and peace, that we may honor one another and serve the common good.
Whoa.
What a great prayer for going to the polls.
Yes.
Guide the people of this land and of all the nations in the ways of justice and peace, that we may honor one another and serve the common good. And followed up immediately, give us all a reverence for the earth as your own creation, that we may use its resources rightly in the service of others, and to your honor and glory.
Is that in the prayer book now?
Yeah.
Yeah. What page is that?
Well, if you have your bulletin, it's Form 4 of the prayers of the people. Those are the second and third petitions we prayed this morning earlier, and we'll pray at the later service.
And yet,
Beautifully
you're
said.
arresting
What can
Native
you say?
Americans.
Well, I'm coming to that. We want to come to that. All right. So, anything else come to mind? Thanks, Chris. That one, I just bookmarked that with a bit of the bulletin this morning because it really struck me this morning as we're praying the prayers. All right, catechism. I'm going to start with the catechism, not with the baptismal covenant. Very first question in the catechism. What are we by nature? We are part of God's creation, made in the image of God. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? It means that we are free to make choices, to love, to create, to reason, and to live in harmony with creation and with God. I think that's political. Go on from there with other questions in the catechism. That's just the first two questions. Goes on and talks about what do we mean by God? What does this mean about our place in the universe? It means that the world belongs to its creator and that we are called to enjoy it and to care for it in accordance with God's purposes. What does this mean about human life? It means that all people are worthy of respect and honor because all are created in the image of God and all can respond to the love of God. That's the world we're invited to imagine and help create. A bit later in the catechism, talk about the mission of the church. Churchill Pinder, if you remember him from he was one of those bishop nominees. You remember back in the day? One of the things he loved to talk about, I got a little tired of, we all got tired of hearing each other, so please understand I'm not picking him out. We heard each other for 6-7 nights in a row, saying mostly the same darn thing one after the other. One of Churchill's favorite things was to talk about what is the mission of the church. The mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other in Christ. And he says that's not the church's mission, that's God's mission. It's God's mission, we're invited to participate in it. The church pursues its mission as it prays, worships, proclaims the gospel, promotes justice, peace, and love.
We haven't done a very good job of that.
A lot narrower than that, I'm afraid.
So, the baptismal covenant, this is what Barbara was getting to. We do the stuff that's from the Apostles' Creed, the traditional church teaching. And then we move on and we say, what are the implications, essentially, of that? Will you continue in the Apostles' teaching and fellowship and the breaking of bread and in the prayers? I will, with God's help. Will you persevere in resisting evil? And whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord? I will, with God's help. Will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ? I will, by God's help. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? I will. I mean, this is getting more and more political by the heartbeat. I will, by God's help. And will you strive, this is as explicit as it gets, strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? I will, by God's help. Yes, ma'am.
Been thinking since last week, and this brings it up again. We talked earlier about the fact that for people of privilege, the idea of equality is a downer. Let's do it that way. What if that's equality? In other words, it's not about how much money I have or where I live or anything like that. It's about whether I do that. And to me, that's a whole different way of looking at equality, and yet somehow that's gaining strength as I think about it. Me.
I think it has implications
Okay.
that take us everywhere.
Yes.
And it doesn't allow any part of it to be put off in a corner and ignored the rest of the week and the rest of the day or the rest of the year, the rest of the life, the rest of the sphere, the rest of whatever the rest is.
But that's what I meant when I said that you put it to the basics. If you think of that first, whenever you have to decide on a question or a person or whatever, if you think of that and see how that fits with that, that makes such a difference.
Yes, I agree.
Good, thank you. Here's a graphic I couldn't give you last week. You were here last week. It frustrated the heck out of me. I figured out how to make it work. It doesn't make any sense. I talked to Bill about it. It doesn't make any sense to either of us that it didn't work, but I got it to work this week. Michael Curry, speaking last week to Executive Council, we're talking about a community of people who are committed to live the way of Jesus. When you look at the light of Jesus of Nazareth, there are a lot of things you would expect. This brother was, and I have to quote him because if I stand up here and talk about Jesus as this brother was, you're going to laugh at me, rightly so. This brother was and is incredibly loving, and that love liberates folk, and liberation gives life to folk. Liberated people can live the life that God has dreamed from the beginning. And so he has this is the Jesus movement as he describes it. And I'll read it to you because you might not see it from where you are. Following Jesus into a loving, liberating, and life-giving relationship with God and each other and with creation. And then he goes on and he talks about these mission priorities that take us outside of just doing churchy things. So evangelism, which is the way of Jesus, the Jesus movement, preaching the gospel, good news, and all the rest, which is also then racial reconciliation and justice, which is also environmental stewardship. Okay, that's how he's doing it. And then these bottom things are just sort of the structures that support the foundation that supports doing the work. And he's talking to Executive Council, so a lot of what he says is about how are we going to make the system work to do the thing we're supposed to be doing instead of just in preserving the institution. Okay.
His last phrase is very interesting.
God's dream and not our nightmare. Yeah, he gets that from a woman named Verna Dozier. God's dream for this world. That's her way of talking about the kingdom. So when we read in the Gospels and talk about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, what Verna Dozier says is that's God's dream for this world. And Michael Curry was tutored by her among others, as were many of us. She's been very helpful for me over the years as well.
I think that's the way Board usually explains it and
Could be.
refers to it. That it's not about getting an elevator to the top
Oh,
floor.
absolutely.
It's about
Absolutely,
making
that's what
things
Marcus would say.
work
Yeah.
here and now.
But then contrasting it with "and not our nightmare," to me, is speaking to what I hear is, therefore, it's not, don't fear it. Don't come from fear.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those memes that's been on social media this week. Heavily armed white men take over native land and threaten to kill, and they're all acquitted.
Yes.
Peaceful native tribes protect land they own through an 1850 treaty, and they're attacked and mass arrested by riot police with tanks, attack dogs, and sound cannons.
Why is it the news keeps saying they're on private land?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, that's owned by the.
Well, it's been taken from them, but the treaty gave it to them.
Yeah, it was then.
Here we are again. This is the three pillars. Michael Curry, and November 3rd has been announced as a day of people of faith to join in solidarity with them. I'm not sure how exactly that's going to be expressed, but Michael Curry has said this is today's soundbite.
It's EPPN disseminated that. It is a request to go to Standing Rock, to physically stand with.
So Episcopalians are encouraged to go
Place to
and actually
RSVP. I
be
mean,
there.
it's, yeah.
but other people of faith too. It's not limited to the Episcopal Church.
Right, it's not that it's
When
it's
is that?
GLCA.
Thursday,
Oh,
November 3rd.
I put it on Facebook, Loretta.
Well,
Let's see, is there a corner we can all go stand on?
Well,
We could do that.
We could
We
do-
could
we
do
could
something
do that
too.
locally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You sure could. We sure
show
could.
of support.
Bring a camera.
No, we don't bring a can. Cross,
No.
maybe.
So, I'm horrified personally by this dissonance. And I think back to some of the other horrifying things that have gone on in this country. I think about white people, white men, bearing arms outside of mosques, and they're protected. I can't imagine if a Muslim were to come up here with a semi-automatic weapon that there wouldn't be an immediate and strong police presence.
Or if
Not
the
sure.
refuge people were not white,
Yeah.
what would that, I mean, I'm not saying the law.
Yeah, I mean,
Be
you know,
properly applied in the trial system.
there are very troubling aspects of this that touch on race and ethnicity and wealth and extraction. This is the other piece that a Native American was articulating, I thought, very well. This is an OPB thing Barb and I both heard this week. The other dynamic is the Malheur occupiers were wanting essentially to have the rights restored for them to extract, if only by cattle grazing, from the natural resources. And they end up getting acquitted, whereas the native revolt here is trying to protect the natural resources, and they're getting put down. What's going on here? It feels very disturbing and distressing. So, yeah, go ahead.
And they were talking, the people at Malheur were talking about restoring their rights
That's right.
to the land, and it really is native rights.
That's right.
And it was
So
all
let's
stolen
talk
from
about
the
whose
plains.
rights were
Yeah.
abridged first.
Careful what you ask for.
Absolutely.
We may go there.
Yeah, if you want to go there, right, exactly. So this is a very troubling, very contemporary thing that is an expression of what was going on. And again, I remind you, and I'm going to have to wrap up partly because we watched Tom Hanks twice.
Uh-huh.
It was worth
Our
it.
fault.
Good, it was your fault. As long as you know it's your fault.
We'll take
But
responsibility.
I have those handouts again that we had last week. If you picked one up last week, there's nothing new there. But if you weren't here last week or you didn't pick one of those up, I have those different resources. Again, you have the Episcopal Public Policy Network, EPPN, it gets abbreviated. They have some materials that might link more specifically to Oregon, but my guess is, frankly, there's not a lot there. You're going to be better off going to something like the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, or again, Betsy did that comparison. That's over there as well with our Rural Organizing Project. But they articulate the same kinds of pieces. And if you're not persuaded by them, do know that there's lots of guides out there in the world. Read them all, reflect on them, consider what your faith says to you about how you vote. I'm not necessarily going to tell you that I've got the right answer. Well, I will, but that doesn't make me right. Please understand, I might be wrong. But you had all sorts of things, including the NRA who sent us a postcard. Actually, they sent it to somebody else, but the post office delivered it to us. Which was really helpful for me to say, oh, well, I know I'm not voting for that person, but that's just me. Last week I shared with this verse from Jeremiah, seek the welfare of the city in which you're finding yourself. That's our calling. Seek the welfare of the place where we are. John Wesley, 1774. I met those of our society who had votes in the ensuing election. And remind you, not everybody had a vote back then, right?
Right.
I met those who had votes and advised them, 1, to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy, 2, to speak no evil of the person they voted against, and 3, to take care their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side. And I leave us with that caveat because I fear that that's where I am, and I know a lot of us are, and I really fear what's going to happen after this election, no matter how it goes, because we continue to harbor ill will against those who vote wrong. So what comes next? I want to return to the gospel I started with last week, Luke 18, the widow and the unjust judge. And David Lose, one of those commentators I look at every week, he blogs, and he almost always gets it out early enough in the week for me to pay attention to it. He says that phrase about the judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. It gets repeated one way or another, both. Because it gets repeated twice, he thinks it's really key. I agree. And he says, this isn't new. You know, this, you fear God, respect those around you. This is classic from the Old Testament and repeated in the Gospel. The great commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Foundational bedrock.
Says it all.
And his further point is take care with one another. The point of this particular piece is, you know, we may agree on what's important, and we may disagree about the ways in which we achieve it. Give each other respect. This is hard, because I'm just owning it myself. I have a real hard time feeling like people who don't see things the way I see it so clearly are doing it from any shred of human, but they are. Just because I have a hard time seeing it doesn't mean it ain't true. We had a small gathering of some of the local clergy, and Dave Beckett, Methodist pastor, said that he's really struggling hard himself, but he's praying. And you might infer who he thinks he's going to vote for and who he wants. He's making a point of praying for the other person. And I'll just leave it at that. Pray for them both. And after the election, I will tell you now that our prayers will include prayers for our President Barack, as they always do, and they will include prayers for blank, our President-elect. Because that happens no matter who gets elected. And after the swearing in, it'll just be for blank, our President. And I've always done that. I know a priest who got real tremendous grief. He was in a very conservative area, and he was insisting they pray for Barack, their president. And they didn't all believe Barack actually should be president, was a Christian, was an American, all the rest. And it was a very conservative place. And he said, no, we do it. And he got out his prayer book. And he says, look, I prayed for George. I prayed for Bill. I prayed for George. I prayed for Ronald. You know, I have a prayer book. I have a record. I always pray for the president, whoever the president is. And we need to show respect. And as he ends here, given the depths to which this election cycle is sunk, we really need this more than ever. Pray, seek the welfare, and pray. And so we have this prayer again, as we did last week. And Mike will just end it. You can join with me if you like, if you can read it from where you are. Almighty God, to whom we must account for all our powers and privileges, guide the people of the United States in the election of officials and representatives by thy faithful administration and wise laws. Rights of all may be protected, and our nation be enabled to fulfill her purposes. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. If you want prayers, one of the sheets over there is a litany of prayer, as well as a selection of other prayers that you might find helpful. Thank you all. I run long.
Thank you. That was